Join us in the fight to restore liberty and American exceptionalism. Together, let's make the case that our charters of freedom are worth defending and honoring. Right here is where the great American experiment comes alive. Let's get to work.
Gentlemen, the second question, the affirmative argument on this question will be Mikel Weisser. Question number 2, should the 8th Amendment be used as evidence to eliminate the death penalty?
The 8th Amendment should be used as evidence to eliminate the death penalty, but actually, when it comes to getting rid of the death penalty, I think that we should take a more serious look at our 5th Amendment, which guarantees due process. Mr. Krauser, notably, is a former prosecuting attorney, and as a prosecuting attorney, is going to take a position that we owe ourselves and our society justice, which comes in the form of blood revenge. Now, I'm going to tell you that when it comes to an idea of killing someone as an expression of justice, that's not truly justice. That's not a legal argument in the slightest. That's an emotional argument. This person has offended me, so I must strike back. When we look at the history of American jurisprudence, of the world's jurisprudence, we find again and again that we have to have protections from errors by prosecutors, errors by overzealous police. People make mistakes 3 different ways. They just make an accidental error. They think they're doing the right thing, but they're wrong. Or they're doing the wrong thing on purpose and feel they can get away with it. We've had things like the Innocence Project and other cases which or other organizations which review death penalty cases and find again and again that justice would not be served if people had been executed. When you execute a person, there's no going back. If you put somebody in prison for 28 years falsely, they may come out to become a Nobel Prize winning leader of a country, such as Nelson Mandela. But if you execute someone unjustly because you didn't have the DNA correct, or because a witness lied, or because a cop needed to protect a friend, or a DA needed another conviction on his career record, then you're not going to have true justice. And if America insists on due process and equal protection, we have to make sure that we don't cross a line where we can't retract to find where justice actually exists.
Okay, Mr. Krauser, you have 1 minute negative cross.
Mr. Weisser, are you against the death penalty under every single circumstance?
Yes.
There is no circumstances under which you would say death is appropriate.
Death is appropriate for all people. We all die in some.
I'm talking about the death penalty. Let's move along. I'm talking about the death penalty.
That it's the role of the government to insist on our powers of life and death.
Okay, so if we had an individual who had killed a 5-year-old, would you be in opposition to the death penalty being implemented?
I would be in opposition to having my bloodlust and revenge exercised for justice.
Yes or no?
I would be opposed to the death penalty in all cases.
What if this individual killed 10 5-year-olds?
If the individual killed my own 2-year-old grandchild, I would grieve for the loss of my child, but I would not be feeling like I deserve retribution of seeing that person's extinguishment.
And is it your position that your argument coincides with the text of the Constitution as well as the founders?
Yes.
Okay.
Negative argument, Mr. Krauser, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. When I was in college, I was actually an individual who was in strong opposition to the death penalty. Both my undergraduate and my graduate work. Strong opposition. And then I came out of this utopian fantasy land called reality and saw the way that the real world works. I worked as a prosecutor for 13 years. And I saw what savage beasts are ultimately capable of. I looked in the eyes of individuals that saw their little ones taken, their wives, their husbands, their brothers, their sisters, their uncles, their aunts. I saw it. And I saw the evidence. And I saw how things really worked in the real world. And ultimately, a light came on for me. Not just an emotional light, but also the light from the perspective of the Constitution and the framers. What I have to say, the argument that you've heard from Mr. Weisser, from my perspective, is nothing more than rhetoric. It's utopian hogwash, is what it ultimately comes down to. It doesn't coincide with the Constitution. It doesn't coincide with the framers. In fact, let me remind you, Mr. Weisser, we had a conversation just 2 months ago down in Yuma. And here's what I asked Mr. Weisser. I said, if I can show you that my positions most coincide with the founders, in fact, better than yours, you coming on board this bandwagon? To this day, he's never answered the question. But he did ask me the same question. He says, if I can show you that my views fall in line with the founders, will you come on board with me? And I said, in a heartbeat, because I'm about the truth. What it ultimately comes down to here is this look at the text of the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment says what? No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. What is a capital offense? Capital offense is an offense that is death penalty eligible. The framers understood this, and they made it very clear that when a capital offense is on the line, there must be an indictment before the government moves forward with the case. But that's not all. The Fifth Amendment also says that life, liberty, or property cannot be deprived of the individual unless what happens? Due process of law. Don't sit here and tell me that the text did not provide for an anticipation that there are some offenses that individuals would die for. They accounted for it in the very text, twice in the Fifth Amendment. And we're not through. The 14th Amendment. No state shall deprive an individual of life, liberty, or property without what? Due process of law. So there we have three accountings in the Constitution itself where death was accounted for and anticipated. In fact, in every single one of the colonies at the time of the founding, and every one of the states in 1788 at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, every single state had the death penalty as an option for certain types of offenses. In fact, it was the federal government in 1790, the federal government implemented the death penalty, and an individual was executed shortly thereafter for violating a federal law. If that's not enough, what about treason? Treason is accounted for in our Constitution. What is the punishment for treason both today and at the time of the founding? Death. So if we want to talk about whose views most coincide with the founders, I think the answer is clear. Unmistakably clear. If we want to talk about whose views most fall in line with the text of the Constitution as well as the founders, it is unmistakably clear. And if you don't like it, there's a great option that is available to Mr. Weisser and other folks. It's called Article 5. Amend the Constitution. Make it so that government can't take life. Lobby your state legislatures. Get them to outlaw the death penalty in their various states. But to suggest that the Constitution never accounted for it is nothing less than absurd. With respect to the Eighth Amendment, they wrote the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. And they anticipated that there might be methods that were utilized to execute people that would be considered cruel and unusual. But the Eighth Amendment is about methodology. It's not about execution in and of itself. That was taken care of in the Fifth and 14th Amendment. So with that being said, I think it's unmistakably clear where the founders fell down on this. It's unmistakably clear what the Constitution says about this. And if you don't like it, amend it.
Thank you. Mr. Weisser, you have affirmative cross-examination, 1 minute.
Mr. Krauser, since we're talking about the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments in general, I'm going to ask you a question from your experience as a prosecutor. Did you ever see an unreliable witness?
Of course.
Did you ever see overzealous uniformed officers?
Yes.
Coercive interrogation during custodial interrogation?
Yes.
And planted evidence?
I don't recall ever seeing that.
How about innocent being found guilty?
In my experience, I know that it's happened, but in my experience, no, never saw that happen.
How many innocent people need to be executed to protect us from having revenge as a motivation in our law?
Well, let me answer that. Fact of the matter is there has not been one individual that has been executed in America's history that was actually found innocent. I'm talking about actually innocent after the execution. There have been individuals that were released from death row prior to the execution. All that proves is that the system works.
Okay, John. Further rebuttal, Michael Weisser, you have 5 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, America is supposed to be about the least and the most of its citizens. It's supposed to be sure that we have equal protection. The Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment were products of a time. You can almost identify the components of the original 7 articles and the first 12, let's say, amendments to the Constitution as reactions to historical problems of the era. We know that historically the rights of the accused were run roughshod by the British government, and to protect our citizens from that being the commonplace standard operating procedure of the American government, the citizenry insisted that a Bill of Rights be added. And I'm going to tell you the preponderance of those Bill of Rights has to do with protecting the individual against the tyranny of the state. When it comes to tyranny of state, you can't get much more tyrannical than taking someone's life. If America is supposed to be a country that is continuing to evolve to a higher standard, then we need to lead through example and not be basing our sense of jurisprudence on revenge. I mean, protecting against the death penalty is essentially an insurance policy against error, against malice, against unknown things that we haven't figured out. Like these days we have people who are being exonerated from cases where they've sat in prison for 20, 30, even 40 years. Now that we have DNA evidence and modern forensic techniques. I don't think that it's right to take away somebody's final recourse for justice by killing them, by snuffing them out, in hopes that maybe we got it right, in the hopes that no innocent were accidentally killed. Protecting for due process, protecting for these errors is why this was written into the Constitution in the first place, and that's why we need to have an abolition of the death penalty according to the 8th Amendment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we have the negative rebuttal summary, 4 minutes, Mr. Krauser.
Mr. Weisser still hasn't shown how the text supports his argument of abolition of the death penalty. He's arguing methodology. That's ultimately what it comes down to in this particular case. He doesn't like the fact that some people are so vile, so heinous, such animals, that the death penalty is ultimately warranted. You know, one thing that's been missing in this conversation is the victim. It's all about the defendant. It's all about the individual who hurt, harmed, and maimed another individual. And to suggest that we can't get it right is absurd. Have there been mistakes in the criminal justice system? Absolutely. There are mistakes that happen, admittedly. But we have procedures in place to protect against this. In fact, there are individuals on death row that are given appeals for 20 to 25 years. If we can't get it right, what are we ultimately doing? So there are situations, of course, where we sit back and we might find that a mistake was made, but to suggest that all of these individuals sitting on death row are somehow innocent couldn't be more absurd. To suggest that there's all of these innocent people not only on death row with the high standard of proof, but all of these individuals that we're incarcerating by implication, there's just gobs and gobs of innocent people. Ultimately, 97% of those individuals who are incarcerated have admitted guilt. They've experienced incarceration because they acknowledge by way of a plea agreement that they are in fact guilty and that they are willing to go to prison to serve their time. That leaves 3% remaining. What happened with those 3%? Generally, they go to trial. And I happen to believe that the founders got it right. that the Fifth and Sixth Amendment, which protect due process, that is the right to a fair trial, a public trial, a speedy trial, the right to cross-examination, the right to compel your own witnesses to come in and testify, the right to the assistance of counsel through the process as you deal with potentially an overbearing and rogue government. I believe those things work. Not only do I believe that they work based on simply the text of the Constitution, but based on a reality of watching individuals beat the system, if you will. That is, the government didn't have the goods, therefore we find the individual not guilty and we let him walk. But I've seen the other side happen just the same. In fact, more often than not, the government met their burden. We have incredible safeguards in place in America to ensure that, in fact, we got it right. The appellate process. I quite frankly think that 20 years of appellate procedures is way too long. It costs us a lot of money. But here's the one thing that you will never hear me concede on. I do not believe that eliminating the appellate process for purposes of economics is the right thing. Because life is at stake. I get it. Liberty is at stake. Economics should not trump what it is that we do with our prisoners. The fact of the matter is that Mr. Weisser made my argument for me. When we start talking about a sympathetic people, about what it is that we ultimately do when it comes to how we treat our criminals, cruel and unusual punishment is forbidden. Look at the way that we treat our criminals in America. It's unmatched to anything else that you'll experience anywhere else in the world. Simply unmatched. And I have to say, I'm awfully proud to be a part of that system. But I'm awfully proud to be a part of a system that recognizes justice. I'm even more proud to be a part of a system where we had founding fathers that recognized that there were some crimes where you just went too far, and death was the only appropriate remedy. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have a round of applause for the two candidates? All right.